Greetings, friends. One decree by Russian President Vladimir Putin has put in place those who may have overreached in their ambitions. Relations between France and Russia, once based on strong economic and political ties, are currently going through a difficult period. Emmanuel Macron's foreign policy aimed at strengthening sanctions and isolating Russia seems to have turned into a mistake, depriving France of key markets and strategic influence. Yes, friends, that's right, one decree from Putin, and everything went down the drain for France. Let's not delay. Let's get started. Judging by information from various sources, including the French media, French President Emmanuel Macron is indeed considering sending French troops to the territory of a well-known country. This is of particular interest, given that back in 2022, Macron relied on diplomacy and positioned France as a mediator in resolving the conflict, regularly communicating with the Russian president. However, his rhetoric has changed radically since then. It is important to understand what is behind such a decision and what goals France is pursuing in this matter. First of all, it is obvious that the immediate fate of Ukraine's neighboring states is not a top priority for the French leadership. The main motive of Paris is to protect its own interests. For example, it recently became known that France intends to join Poland in restricting imports of agricultural products from neighboring countries of Ukraine. According to estimates by Politico, such a decision could lead to losses of about €1 billion, which is a very significant amount for these countries, especially in the current difficult economic situation. However, it is more important for Macron to satisfy the needs of French farmers and maintain his domestic political stability than to take into account the interests of other European partners. To understand the reasons for the sudden change in the French leader's political course and his statements about possible military involvement, it is worth recalling his attempts to establish relations with China and interact with the BRICS Association. At a time when Western economies are facing serious challenges, the BRICS countries are showing growth and strengthening their positions in the global economy. Emmanuel Macron is aware that the traditional Western mechanisms of dominance are weakening, and countries leading independent policies are gradually increasing their influence. However, while many states remain closely linked to Washington and are forced to follow its decisions, France has a certain degree of autonomy due to its developed military-industrial complex, nuclear potential, and its own energy infrastructure. This gives the French leader room for maneuver and the opportunity to promote ideas about creating an independent European army. Nevertheless, his attempts to get closer to the BRICS were unsuccessful. Despite Macron's interest in this format, France was not invited to the summit. One of the reasons may be the cautious attitude of the BRICS countries towards the strategic intentions of Paris. After all, Macron, being a politician closely associated with the financial elites, could use this cooperation primarily to improve France's economic situation and strengthen its industrial potential, and then at any moment change the policy vector and return to closer cooperation with Washington. After the BRICS doors were closed, Macron began to look for other ways to strengthen France's position on the world stage. One of the directions was a policy aimed at restoring influence in African countries that historically had close ties with Paris. The French authorities are concerned that France's influence in Africa has weakened in recent years, especially after the events in Niger, where access to uranium resources critical to the French nuclear power industry was cut off. Macron turned his attention to Kazakhstan in search of alternative suppliers, but even their French companies face competition, including Russian interests in the region. In this situation, France faced a difficult choice. On the one hand, Macron understands that it will be extremely difficult to resolve the uranium issue without negotiations with Russia, as Moscow plays a significant role in the logistics and energy processes of the region. On the other hand, he is probably considering the possibility of increasing pressure on Russia in order to achieve more favorable terms for France. This may explain his harsh statements and discussions about the possible deployment of a military contingent, which creates additional tension in the region. And that's where the fun begins, friends. French President Emmanuel Macron probably hoped to increase pressure on Russia in order to achieve more favorable conditions for his country. In this regard, the idea of a possible deployment of French troops appeared. However, it is difficult to say whether he seriously considered such a scenario or used such statements as an element of a diplomatic maneuver. It is quite possible that the deployment of the French military on the territory of a well-known country, for example, near the border with Belarus, could free up additional forces for the front line. In this case, Paris would have received an additional tool of influence, and Macron could have stated that his position was misinterpreted and that he did not seek to escalate the conflict at all. This could also be an argument for a possible revision of the arms supply policy. However, it was obvious that such statements were more symbolic in nature, and therefore, despite the discussion of this issue, Russia continued to implement its decisions without changes. At the same time, some former French colonies in Africa continued their policy of revising relations with Paris, which created additional challenges for French diplomacy. In the current situation, Macron found himself in a difficult position. On the one hand, the statements he made required confirmation by actions, otherwise his authority could weaken. But on the other hand, direct military involvement could lead to an undesirable escalation. As a compromise option, the possibility of sending a limited military contingent was considered, which would not have a significant impact on the course of events, but would allow the French leadership to maintain its position. However, such a move is fraught with risks, including possible military casualties, which could cause concern among the French public. In the end, it remains likely that Macron will prefer to refrain from such actions, focusing on diplomatic tools. In an interview with Le Parisien, Macron noted that Russia cannot determine the composition and format of assistance to a well-known country from its partners. He also stated the need to continue pressure on Moscow in order to reach agreements on ending the conflict. In this regard, Paris is considering the possibility of increasing the production of weapons, which, according to the French leadership, should also contribute to the country's economic growth. Earlier, Macron had already stated that European states have the right to independently decide on the deployment of their military units on the territory of a well-known country. According to him, the presence of allied forces in third countries does not require coordination with other parties. In addition, the French president expressed readiness to consider additional support measures, including possible supplies of aviation equipment. In response to these statements, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs noted that Paris continues a policy that does not take into account Moscow's key interests. The Russian Foreign Ministry stressed that such an approach does not contribute to reducing tension and finding compromise solutions. The Russian Foreign Ministry also stated in a statement that Macron's speech referred to security guarantees for Ukraine, but similar issues regarding Russia were not raised. Moscow believes that the lack of a clear dialogue on security issues, along with the expansion of NATO and the change in the strategic balance in the region, has become one of the causes of the current crisis. Russia has repeatedly and over the years expressed concern about the threat from the West, including against French President Emmanuel Macron. The Russian Foreign Ministry recalled that the Russian authorities had repeatedly warned Western leaders, including Macron, about the risks associated with Western policies. In response to the French president's statements that Russia poses a threat to France and Europe, Macron proposed starting a discussion on the use of French nuclear weapons to protect the European Union. However, the Russian leadership understands this scenario perfectly well and is not going to fall into the trap set. Sergei Lavrov made it clear that Russia has a clear plan to exit the strategic fork. The foreign minister stressed that the United States and Europe have a misconception about their own security. Washington sincerely believes that due to its geographical location, it can stay on the sidelines. However, Moscow is not going to play by these rules and has its own ways of doing so. Lavrov recalled that American and European politicians are increasingly making reservations that betray their true intentions. As an example, he cited the words of John Kirby, coordinator of the White House National Security Council, who made it clear in one of his statements that in the event of a global conflict, Europe would become the main theater of military operations. Russia, in turn, takes these circumstances into account and acts cautiously. Lavrov's response showed that Moscow does not intend to play the game according to the rules imposed by Washington. The Kremlin is aware of the risks and is taking measures to prevent the implementation of the Western scenario. Thus, the Russian minister's statement was another signal that Moscow is ready to defend its interests and will not allow the imposition of strategies beneficial only to Europe or the United States. Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov described Macron's remarks as extremely confrontational. He stressed that these statements contain many inaccuracies, including the lack of mention of the expansion of NATO's military infrastructure, which was moving step by step closer to the Russian borders, which raises legitimate concerns of Moscow. A mistake in French policy, according to the Russian Foreign Ministry, leads to serious consequences. Thus, France is losing its most important sales markets. It is especially unpleasant for French manufacturers that these markets are now partially replaced by Russia. And that's where Putin's decree appears on the scene. A striking example of this is the situation in North Africa, where Macron's decisions actually contributed to the deterioration of the position of French manufacturers. Previously, France remained the main supplier of agricultural products to a number of African countries, including Algeria, but in recent years its position has begun to weaken. 3 years ago, France was still exporting about €1 billion worth of agricultural goods to Algeria. However, in recent years, supply volumes have declined sharply, and last year they almost dried up altogether. The reason for this, among other things, was Macron's political decision to support Morocco in the dispute over the status of Western Sahara, which caused a negative reaction from Algeria, which has traditionally been an ally of France. After Paris finally sided with Morocco, Algeria responded by worsening relations and rejecting French goods. As an alternative, Algeria began to actively cooperate with Russia, which now covers 90% of the country's grain needs. France, in turn, has lost a stable sales market and profits, as well as faced refusals to participate in tenders and even disregard from former buyers. For example, French cattle producers, which exported products worth €167 million last year, experienced a sharp drop in sales in this segment. The situation with powdered milk and cheeses in Algeria has also worsened, as the country has found new suppliers, including from New Zealand. Meanwhile, Morocco, being an important ally of France, has significantly increased the volume of supplies of Russian goods, including grain, which last year entered the country in volumes 3 times higher than in previous years. This also applies to sunflower oil, purchases of which were resumed after a 5-year hiatus. As a result, Russian exports to Morocco increased significantly in 2024 to $280 million, with plans to increase the volume to $350 million annually. France continued to lose its market share as Morocco opened its markets to Russian goods, offering more attractive prices. French media have noted that Russia is actively increasing its presence on the grain market in Africa, including in Morocco and other countries in the region. Russian agricultural exports are growing not only in North Africa, but also in other regions. For example, Russia supplied 20% more agricultural products to Egypt, one of the largest grain importers, than in the previous year. Tunisia has also seen an increase in Russian exports, particularly wheat, which gives the country additional opportunities to diversify its supplies. In this context, France, which has long been considered an important player in the agricultural market, is gradually losing its position, giving way to countries such as Russia, which provide stable and competitive supplies at more favorable prices. Friends, now I want to express my opinion. This article makes you think about how France's relations with Russia have changed dramatically in recent years. The two countries were once important partners, and France played a significant role in Europe's economic and political affairs. However, the new course chosen by Emmanuel Macron may turn out to be wrong. Difficult political decisions, such as supporting anti-Russian sanctions and focusing on Western interests, have led France to lose important markets that used to be profitable for it. Economic losses, such as the reduction in French grain supplies, suggest that excessive politicization of foreign policy may not be the best solution, especially if historical and cultural ties with major players such as Russia are not taken into account. On the other hand, attempts to rewrite foreign policy and completely eliminate the possibility of dialogue with Russia can lead to even greater economic consequences. France, with its strong economy and rich history of diplomatic relations, risks losing not only stable markets, but also the opportunity to play the role of mediator in global issues. Macron's position may turn out to be too harsh, and a loss of balance in relations with Russia could lead to long-term consequences that would affect both the French economy and its political influence in the world.